The next content-based feature involves a framing structure operating in block 3C, that is from verses 15 through 20. The core of block 3C focuses on benefits, communal and conjugal, that accrue to marital faithfulness. In balanced fashion, 2 verses are devoted to each of these 2 benefits, 2 verses to communal, 2 verses to conjugal. Communal benefits are in verses 16 and 17, conjugal benefits in 18 and 19. Framing these 4 verses is a single verse before and another single verse after. Single verse before, we're pointing here to verse 15. Single verse after, verse 20. The first, that is verse 15, pointedly charges the youth to preserve marital faithfulness. Drink water from your cistern and rivulets from your well. We're labeling that Unit 3C1. The last, that is verse 20, closes this portion by challenging the youth to think of any good reason why, after this grand recital of benefits, why any thinking person should prefer promiscuity over marital faithfulness. And because of the balancing, the framing action, reflecting its connection with verse 15, we're labeling verse 20 Unit 3C1'. Another content-based microstructure involves the contrasting fields of benefit that are found within Unit 3C2, that is, from verses 16 through 19. This was alluded to in the previous microstructure. We simply want to focus on it a little more concisely here. So, 2 contrasting fields of benefit comprise the segments that are within Unit 3C2, that is, 16 through 19. Communal benefits occupies the first. These are described as channels of water within verses 16 and 17. You might be interested to know that in Isaiah 32:2, a benevolent leader is compared to channels of water, that is, bringing benefit to those that he leads. And there, this operates without any sexual connotation. The second benefit, or field of benefit, contrasting communal, then, are conjugal benefits, and these occupy verses 18 to 19. This is what we mean by pointing out this structure, which consists of contrasting fields of benefit within the 4 verses of Unit 3C2. Another microstructure involves progression of thought from Unit 3C1 to 3C2. 3C1 is verse 15, drink water from your cistern and rivulets from your well. Notice there the dimension of the water. Cistern, while an excellent water supply for the dry Middle East, is a confined amount of water. Well, similarly, is confined. It's described as issuing forth in rivulets. This is different, however, when we come to verse 16, where we move into 3C2, first part of 3C2. There we read, may your springs overflow outside, in the plazas, channels of water. Contrast springs with cistern. Springs, a limitless supply, fresh, not stagnant at all. And the description overflowing outside. This is not confined, but rather there's a greater volume of generosity. It's moving out into the plazas where a wider community is located. Channels of water. Once again, it's not like a bucket or a cistern or a well where the water is confined, but it's flowing. This is fresh water, moving water, rather than stationary water. This is what we mean by a progression of thought. We find a greater volume as we move from 15 into 16. In this way, the sage indicates that a small but healthy conjugal unit, that's verse 15, may bring exponential benefit to the greater community, verse 16. The last content-based microstructure involves a character summary in the final section, that is section 4, spanning verses 21 to 23. The sage closes the entire lecture by means of an incentive that's folded into a character summary. To the character that embraces ethical conduct, the sage devotes a single saying filled with hope, that is verse 21. If a person's ways are straight before the Lord's eyes, he paves all his tracks. On the other hand, the sage spends 2 verses to describe the intractable and deadly demise of the unethical, foolish fellow, verses 22 and 3. They read, "His misdeeds will trap the guilty, and in the snares of his sin he will be held fast. He will die for lack of discipline, and due to his widespread foolishness he will stagger." Before proceeding to concluding remarks, it will be worthwhile to entertain some comments about particular portions of this lesson. These comments are not designed so much to illuminate structure as they are designed to clarify some of the connotations and implications of the teaching presented in Proverbs chapter 5. Let's begin with some comments related to verse 3. Earlier, veiled references to wisdom cast her as a female character. These can be found in chapter 4, verses 6 and 8, and this will be the case with later poems as well. Chapter 6, verse 22, chapter 7, verses 4, and chapter 8, verses 1 and following, and again chapter 9, 1 and following. The fact that wisdom is cast as a female character raises the possibility that the foreign woman here in chapter 5 may also be merely a literary device, not a literal figure. However, notice that the foreign woman's counterpart here in chapter 5 is the youth's actual wife. Especially this is clear in verses 15 to 19 of chapter 5. Consequently, in this poem, the foreign woman is also a literal figure, like the wife, not limited to a literary device. Since the issue of foreignness figures largely in this poem and will surface in poem number 5 and 6 and 7 as well, it may be helpful to consider briefly a. What conditions in ancient times may lead one to leave one's homeland and so be a foreigner elsewhere. B. What terms the biblical writers used to designate persons who came from a different land. And C. What were the reasons for treating foreigners with a general sense of caution, such as we find here in Proverbs 5. First then, consider what conditions in ancient times may lead one to leave one's own homeland. Unlike today, very few would have possessed the means and interest to travel simply for the sake of business or mere curiosity. Due to conditions of lawlessness extending between zones of civilization, such a venturer would require wealth of sufficient amount to afford protection. We can take a look at Ezra chapter 8, verses 21 and following to get a sense of the need of protection when you're traveling out in the open. In contrast to commerce or mere curiosity, duress would have been a more common cause for relocation, whether duress propelled by famine. Think of the family of Elimelech that's described in Ruth 1, having to relocate to Moab on account of famine. Or due to the duress of enslavement and forced removal from homeland as a prisoner of war or trapped in debt. Think of the Syrian general by the name of Naaman, who held captive an Israelite servant girl, 2 Kings 5. Or it could happen if one is a fugitive from one's own people due to political intrigue. David fled to Gath in order to hide from Saul, 1 Samuel 27, verse 4. Or it could be the result of exile. We find an account of this in Herodotus, where he tells of some men from a region called Colophon, who were defeated in their own city and then expelled by a rival faction, eventually winding up at Smyrna. So the first we've considered is conditions in ancient times which may lead one to leave one's own homeland. Second, what terms did biblical writers employ to designate persons who were from a different land? While there are several, two are especially useful. Whenever possible, it is important to note whether a traveler in a biblical account is tagged as a sojourner, the Hebrew term there is ger, or tagged as a foreigner, the Hebrew term there is zar. A sojourner, although alien, would seek not to abuse the hospitality of his hosts. Ruth's father-in-law, Elimelech, for example, is an Israelite described as a sojourner when he is in Moab. He is not described as a foreigner. The Lord repeatedly charged his people to treat with generosity the displaced who sojourned in Israel. Leviticus 19:33 and 4. Frequently, they cooperated with Israelite customs as virtual proselytes. Some who made Israel their home gained heroic reputations. Think of Rahab and Ruth. In contrast, the Hebrew term foreigner or stranger signified a difference which boded animosity and suspicion, not a relationship of mutual cooperation. Throughout Proverbs 4 through 9, it is this foreigner, not the sojourner, whom the grandfather cautions against. Third, then, what were the reasons for treating such foreigners with a general sense of caution? The caution regarding the foreign woman, or foreign man, as we will encounter in chapter 6, verse 1, involves three distinct concerns. First, out of a normal commitment to one's own ethnic or family group, the foreigner would tend to advance his own inner group, traveling with him, or a group that he represented at a distance. He would tend to advance that group at the expense of other groups, such as the host groups of the local land in which he found himself. Thus, in poem number 4, that is Proverbs 5, the youth suffers harm not only at the hands of one foreign woman, but also at the hands of an entire foreign community, as he winds up spending the balance of his brief life in servitude to them. There is a second reason for treating foreigners with a sense of caution. The tendency to prefer one's own group translated into a greater willingness to engage deception toward another group. Think of the Midianite deception recorded in Numbers 25:18 and following, or the Gibeonite deception in Joshua 9. In the fugitive and exile examples that we referred to a bit ago, both David and the guests from Colophon, described by Herodotus, deceived their hosts. During a festival, the Colophonites seized possession of Smyrna, their host city, through treachery. And as for David, while based in Gath, David lied to the king of Gath concerning which cities it was that he had been destroying on his periodic raids. Interestingly, Philistine leaders who were confederate with Gath were suspicious and cautious concerning welcoming the foreigner military figure David into a joint forces maneuver against the Israelite city of Jezreel. They were afraid that David might revert to Israelite loyalties and then turn and contribute to a defeat of Philistia. Third, religious beliefs and practices initially may appear complementary to one's own commitments, but ultimately may prove fundamentally alien, deceptive, and dangerous. Consider, for example, the foreign adulterous woman's peaceable sacrifices and slaughter that we will encounter in Proverbs 7:14 and 22. In this regard, the men of Israel transgressed and suffered substantially when they succumbed to the lure of women of Moab and the religious practices into which they drew the men of Israel. That's Numbers 25. Another example of how morals of other nations might undermine those of Israel may be seen in the practices of the ancient Lydians, an illustration even more to the point of the foreign woman's aims here in Proverbs 5. According to the 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus, quote, working-class girls in Lydia prostitute themselves without exception to collect money for their dowries and continue the practice until they marry. They choose their own husbands. This is a report of Herodotus. We can imagine this practice then perhaps occurring in the context of foreigners coming to Israel and being a lure, a danger toward the sort of pupils that the sage is seeking to train and protect. Finally, in this regard, several elements concerning the hazard of the foreign woman here in Poem 4 are reminiscent of the Samson stories. To begin with, Samson was repeatedly attracted to foreign women, against which the sage here clearly cautions. Samson also suffered bodily harm as his eyes were gouged out. Compare this with chapter 5, verse 11, which reads, so that you will groan in your last days as your flesh and body waste away. At the end, Samson spent his legendary strength for others as he ground Philistine grain while a captive in their community. Compare that to chapter 5 of Proverbs, verses 9 and 10, where the sage warns, lest you give over to outsiders your splendor and your years to the cruel, lest foreigners eat their fill of your exertion and of your hard toil in a stranger's house. And that became the setting of Samson's death amid a crowd of people who were to him foreigners. Notice chapter 5, verse 14 of Proverbs. The youth hypothetically reports, in no time at all I was totally ruined amid the congregation and assembly. Next, please direct your attention to verses 12 through 14. It would be difficult to overestimate, I believe, the magnitude of contribution to the grandfather's overall teaching here in Proverbs 4 through 9, the contribution which is made by this hypothetical confession coming from the youthful victim. In terms of its content, it exposes an Achilles heel which afflicts adolescents universally, namely disdain for reprimand. In terms of voice, it speaks as the hypothetical testimony of one of their peers, which would be virtually unassailable in terms of persuasive power. In terms of desperation, the ruin of physical health, established in verse 11 and underscored again in verse 14a, portrays these as the words of a dying man, hoping that his too late realization of folly at least may serve to safeguard someone else. The rhetorical or persuasive artistry of this composition is exceeded only by the importance of its message. If only the youth will go against the tide and cultivate the prescience of remaining receptive to reprimand, he will be able to sidestep so many needless obstacles and thus live a life of rich fulfillment. While this reprimand has in focus the principle of marital fidelity, the poem is also useful for modeling how to encourage reprimand receptivity on a more general scale. It may also be instructive to note that while the youth's lips need wisdom preparation to avoid succumbing to the foreign woman's lips, notice verse 2b and verse 3, upon reflection the youth realizes that the underlying fault lay not with lips, but with another part of his body, namely his mind. He had embraced a reprimand-resistant attitude. This admission confirms the priority of, quote, protecting your mind, end quote, before any other body part, which you will recall was a priority established by the grandfather in chapter 4, verse 23. The next comment focuses on verse 14. In no time at all, I was totally ruined amid the congregation and the assembly. Concerning the convening of a judicial inquest in response to youthful promiscuity, as described here, congregation and assembly, Waltke in his commentary observes, quote, it is a social, not just a personal offense, and it, that is, adultery or sexual promiscuity, it still ruins political careers, end quote. The next comment arises from verses 15 through 17. The sage here paints a winsome picture of a healthy community founded on solid marriages. Resources generously overflow to refresh the wider community, as was commented earlier. As a result of their strength and fidelity, this couple is able to refresh many beyond themselves. When we inquire where these resources originate, we find they come from families comprised of a husband and a wife who intentionally guard an exclusive commitment to each other. Verse 15. As a result, they retain control over the benefits they produce, whether emotional, intellectual, or material. That's verse 17. And it contrasts what we saw in 9 and 10, where their benefactions are controlled by an outsider who is holding the individual captive. The volume of benefit that this strong marriage produces exceeds that which they can consume. We've seen this earlier. The volume that's described in 16 exceeds that was described in 15. This results in dispersal to the benefit of many in the community. And please turn next to focus on verses 16 through 19. All four of the benefits described in 16 through 19 are described not as reliable, certain outcomes, but rather as desirable results that the sage sincerely hopes will accrue to the youth. This is based on the fact that these forms are adjussive in mood, not indicative. Here are some of the phrases. Verse 16, may your springs overflow outside. That contrasts what would be indicative. Your springs will overflow outside. Verse 17, may they belong to you alone. And that is in contrast to the indicative, which would read, they shall belong to you alone. Verse 18, may your fountain be blessed, not your fountain will be blessed, and so on. If we pause to consider why it is that the sage expressed these as possibilities or sincere hopes rather than certain future, it may be that through this more tentative tone, the sage signals his awareness that marriage is a two-sided partnership, One can only behave so as to increase the likelihood of a desirable response. One can never fully guarantee how the other party will, in fact, respond. And a last comment before making some observations about the overall message of this poem causes us to focus on verses 21 through 23. Since the importance of, quote, paving one's track, end quote, was already established in chapter 4, verse 26, the preceding poem, now for the Lord himself to provide this same service constitutes an immense asset, well worth whatever effort may be required to make one's ways straight before the sight of the Lord. Verse 21. In the remaining two verses, 22 and 3, with classic retributive justice, no divine intervention is required for the guilty to encounter their demise. It will be their own misdeeds, their own sin, which will ensnare them.